Welcome to TXOGA Talks, where energy meets insight. The purpose of this podcast is to provide you with a candid conversation about our energy needs, our energy security, and your energy future. Texas oil and natural gas have made our nation the world's energy leader, constantly innovating and investing to fuel the economy, protect the environment, and power the world. This industry is fast-paced, high-tech, and essential to improving modern life. And we're here to talk about it. You're listening to TXOGA Talks, where energy meets insight. Thanks for joining us again for another episode of TXOGA Talks. I'm Todd Staples with TXOGA. Glad to be joined by Shana, Joyce, Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs.
Always happy to be here, Todd.
Shana, we know in Texas we've just finished up what has been a very long primary season. We had the initial balloting in March. We had runoffs all across the state in May. I imagine everyone's wanting to take a break from politics, but I'm kind of a political junkie. I really think there's a lot of work to be done. And as I think about turning from Texas, I look at the national scene. We've got a presidential election. U.S. Senate's up for grabs. U.S. House is up for grabs. I'm so glad today that we have an expert on national politics. We have Tim Stewart with us. Tim is a veteran on broadcast shows. He's a frequent guest on Fox News. He's a proud graduate of the University of Utah State University, I think. And there you go. And even though he spent a lot of years in Washington, D.C., Tim is a real person still. I know that's kind of hard to believe, folks, when you think about Washington, D.C. Tim, thanks for joining us today.
It's great to be with you. You guys think things are crazy in Texas. We'll just jack that up to 11 in Washington, D.C. That's the level we're at right now.
Oh, my.
Well, I don't know if y'all influenced us or we influenced y'all. I think the states need to do more influencing of our federal government, and our world would be a better place.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Texas has a great way of doing things. And frankly, we could mirror that all across the country and we'd be a lot better off.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's been fun to work with Tim Stewart, folks, president of the United States Oil and Gas Association. Tim has been there when Texas has needed some help in D.C. We've got a lot of help, obviously, there, but it's a big place, and it's not a fun place. Tim, I'm glad you're there, not me. I'm glad to be in Texas, and you've been here many times. But today we wanted to start off about talking about the real balance of power in D.C. What's going on in the balance of power in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House? People listen to this every night on different news channels, but what's your take of the balance of power and how is that influencing how policy's been done?
Todd, we really do live in a 50-50 country. That's evident all across the board as you look at it. And particularly in the U.S. Congress, you have a margin that is razor thin in the House and in the Senate. In the House, you have 218 Republicans and 213 Democrats. In the Senate, the Democrats have a 51-49 advantage. This is reflected in virtually everything that we do, every aspect of politics, from the presidential race down to the Congress. We'll get more into this, I'm sure, but the bottom line is oftentimes divided government is good, but gridlock is bad. And we are in a very fine line between divided government and gridlock on almost every issue.
So how many seats are needed to flip each chamber if you just said it's very close margin. So what is that in each chamber?
Yeah, so in the Senate, for example, 51-49 Democrat majority. The Republicans would have to flip 2 of those seats to gain the outright majority. Right now, that seems to be on track, but the GOP has this tendency, I think, to snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory oftentimes. Things come down to a 50-50 split like they had in the 2020 election. Control of the Senate comes down to who actually controls the White House, because the vice president is the president of the Senate and casts the tie-breaking vote. On the House side, Shana, the GOP currently theoretically controls the House with 218 votes. That is the actual majority of the 435 makeup of Congress. It's a bare number to hold that majority with one. There are 4 vacancies right now. 3 of them are GOP and 1 of them are Democrats. So all things being equal, if the Democrats flip 5 seats, they didn't win in the last midterm, they regain control of the House by the same razor-thin majority. They had a razor-thin majority in the last Congress, and it seemed to work much better for them, actually. They seem to figure out how to rule as a majority with a very tiny margin of votes. The Republicans have not figured that out yet.
Interesting.
I kind of like it when Congress can't do much. It seems like we're protected, but I think you're right, Tim. We still need to fund our military. We still need to build our roads. We need to do some basic blocking and tackling, and it's difficult because even though if Republicans are in control by a seat or two in the House or Senate, or Democrats were, not all Republicans think alike, and not all Democrats think alike. And then when things are so partisan that you can't build alliances, it does kind of lead to gridlock, and that's not good for our country.
You know, they used to say there's an old saying that things went to hell in this country when they put air conditioning in the Capitol in Washington, right? Because Congress used to go home for the summer. And when they weren't in session, then things were much quieter and much better for the country as a whole. But Todd, to your point, I think you're exactly right. This is a challenge for the GOP. This race within majority has a faction of the Republican majority that think and act as if they have much more room to maneuver than they actually have. And so if you have a 3 or 2 vote margin and you say as a Republican that I'm not going to vote for this most passed piece of legislation, it's like keeping the government open or funding the military. The government has to stay open and the military has to be funded. And by saying no, you cede that ground to your opposition and give them all the leverage. And then you're outraged when those who hold all the leverage use it against you. It's a really interesting time right now. And I think the Republicans have got to learn some hard lessons here, how to function as a majority.
I think we need to have "Why Can't We Be Friends" playing in the background as we're having this
Just constantly.
conversation. Yeah, maybe we should. You talked about some races in the Senate, and so I know we've got a race in Texas. I'd like for you to address Senator Cruz's race, and then races in other states that people need to pay attention to that would tip the balance of the Senate.
Yeah, and you guys are much closer to the Texas race than I am, so I'd be interested in your thoughts as well. Fact of the matter is, it's a favorable map for the Senate GOP. They really have to defend Texas and Florida. And in a normal year, both would be fine as long as you don't get outworked or outspent. And I spoke with the Cruz team a couple times over the last few days. And this is a race that, if you're a Republican, you cannot take for granted. When you're in a 50-50 Senate scenario, one way to mitigate an unfavorable Senate map is to take out your top target. And Ted Cruz for the Democrats is the top Senate target. Most polls have that at a fairly tight race, and you've probably seen them more than I have. But I think Team Cruz knows what's at stake. The issue, as you all know, is the changing demographics of Texas. You have a lot of Texas metro areas that look like Atlanta or Las Vegas or Richmond or Seattle in terms of those demographics. And the question, and you guys probably have a better feel of this than I do, is has Texas become sufficiently Californicated to make it look like a Colorado or a Nevada? Is it a Cracker Barrel election or is it a Whole Foods election? Do you get the excerpts and the rurals out versus the granola crunchers in Austin out? I do think Team Cruz seems to do everything they need to do. They know they're going to be outspent and they're going to be outraised for sure. The questions for the Democrats, though, is do you spend that money in Texas or are you trying to defend Ohio or Maryland, for example? And does the Senate map open up more over the summer? So that's kind of my take on the Texas race. I'd be interested in your thoughts as well.
Well, I think you hit it spot on. I think for anyone to think this is a foregone conclusion, a foregone outcome, they're really not plugged into what's taking place. I think it is going to be an attraction for tons of money from outside of Texas coming in to try to influence this race. I think we'll have to see what kind of traction the Democratic nominee gets. He won the Democratic nomination very easily. Seemed like people coalesced around him. He did spend some money to do that. Colin already did. He's from the North Texas area, which is certainly a dynamic part of Texas. And so it'll be an interesting race to watch, but I think Cruz is working hard, and it'll be interesting to see how that shapes up. You mentioned Ohio and Maryland as two other states that we need to be paying attention to as well.
Yeah, there are a number of Senate races around the nation that are shaping up to be pretty close. If you just rattle them off, Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Montana, all could go one way or the other. The GOP will win in West Virginia. That one's about the safest seat you're going to get. But ironically, the next best chances, according to the folks here in D.C., for a GOP flip would be in Montana to take out Senator John Tester, and ironically in Maryland, of all places, one of the bluest states in the nation. Governor Hogan decided he was going to jump into the race, and that was the surprise of all surprises. And that's why I say that opened up the Senate map a little bit. The next tier where they're good GOP candidates are places like Ohio or Pennsylvania. And then there's a lot of tier 3 races that depend a lot on the coattails of the president or President Trump, depending where those materialize. And that's when you're looking at places like Wisconsin or Michigan, Nevada and Arizona, and maybe or maybe not New Mexico. The races in Montana is particularly interesting because John Tester, who's the subcommittee chair on energy and water and controls a lot of things like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and LNG exports and things like that. So that's I think it's going to be an interesting Senate map. If frankly the GOP is really lucky in a year like this, the numbers are in their favor.
That's interesting. Now let's move to the U.S. House. I know in Texas we've had a few retirements, so we're going to see some new members here from Texas. But what Texas races are you watching, and what other states are you watching?
Yeah, that's a great question. The House is going to be fiercely competitive as always. And like we mentioned earlier, it doesn't help when you have a sort of a Shiite faction of your own caucus that blows a place up repeatedly. And so what happens in Texas is interesting because you have to look at what happens in New York or California as well. In New York and California, the GOP is defending seats that the Biden carried. There's about 20 seats that are being defended in those two seats. Redistricting is going to have an issue in Alabama and Louisiana, which has put a couple GOP seats in play, one each. But ironically, redistricting in North Carolina has given the GOP 4 seats. And so when you're talking 4 or 5 seats, all of a sudden this map becomes very, very complicated. Outside of Texas as well, say, for example, up in Michigan, John James, he was a Republican on the Energy and Commerce Committee. We're watching that one carefully. You got a couple of California seats. But in Texas, you guys always have a tendency to rise up and do the right thing when it comes to oil and gas. And so we're dependent from the industry's perspective. We're looking to you all to kind of sort that out the best. Texas 26 is one that we're watching, for example. Michael Burgess is retiring, and I think it's Brandon Gill is coming in behind there. And Todd, you've got a good feel on that one too. So I'd look to you as well.
Yeah, I mean, Texans of all persuasions pretty much still understand that oil and natural gas fuels modern life. They recognize how important it is to jobs, to growing the economy. And quite frankly, I think people recognize that the industry is spending billions of dollars on environmental stewardship and to care for our climate. And so even though there's a lot of other narratives that are out there, voters understand what drives this state economy, and voters understands the quality of life that we have because of oil and gas. And so you generally, in most of these seats, you see good things happening. Craig Goldman, former Texas state representative, was chair of the Texas House Energy Committee. He just won a runoff pretty handily that he was in the Fort Worth area to replace Kay Granger. And so, I think Texans, Republicans and Democrats alike pretty much are supportive of oil and gas. Tim, do you think, a lot of this depends on how the presidential race goes, I would imagine. Is that fair to say in terms of the House and Senate? I know it can be different, but it seems like to me that has an influence.
Yeah, it really does. Again, that coattails issue for either candidate is going to be the thing that pushes, probably 8 to 10 of these seats over the top. The interesting thing, though, is his question is like, what happens with ticket splitting, for example? This is, if you look at the top tier presidential election, this is election that none of us wanted, but all of us deserve, so to speak, right? There's enthusiasm to. It's interesting. I talked to my wife and her friends, for example. She's the standard sort of suburban GOP female voter who is not particularly enthused about what her options are. The question is when you finally get down to marking that ballot and mailing it in or going into the voting booth, for example, where do you split that ticket? How do you mitigate that? And that's why you see these races are so tight, regardless. If you look at the Senate races and you go through all those, there's no candidate that is ahead by 12 or 14 points. So it's a 2 or 4 point margin all across the board.
Well, we have a rerun. We talked about movie reruns earlier. Summer's out. We've got new films hitting the airways, but we also have a bunch of reruns. A lot of times the reruns are not that good. And so it'll be very interesting to see how the Trump-Biden versus the Biden-Trump ends up being. And I'm interested to know, Tim, of the Senate states, the states where the Senate seats are in play, are those the same states in the presidential election, or is there any differences?
Yeah, they almost stack up almost immediately because, and again, that's why the map is so favorable to the Republicans in this particular year. If you look at the battleground presidential states, you have Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Nevada, and Wisconsin. Those are the ones that people are really looking at. And so all of a sudden you have, Arizona and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Nevada as also key battleground seats where there are Senate candidates up who could control the Senate as well. And so I think, ironically, in an election where we'll spend more money than any other time in history, it's going to come down to 3 or 4 states as to who controls the presidency and at the same time controls the Senate.
Well, I pity those folks that are in states that are swing, because they're going to be inundated with all types of political ads here going all the way through November. I'm sure there's people on the ground already in those states knocking on doors, and it just never ends.
If you think about just the Texas primary election, I think someone texted me a picture of all of the things all of the mailers they had gotten in that Phelan race, and it was a lot.
Tim, Shana has her vote bracelet on today just to inspire us for this conversation.
So, it's a saturation problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the same thing. How do you filter through a 3-inch stack of mailers that are almost all identical? It's a really tough situation. So, but you're right. I pity the Pizza Planet owner who's trying to get his advertising rates out for the special for this weekend, because he can't afford to do that anymore. So,
well, we've covered these races. We've covered the House, Senate, presidential race. Tim, look, oil and gas is indispensable to modern life. And I know our listeners who may not be plugged into oil and gas may say, well, you're the oil and gas guy, Tim's the oil and gas guy, Shana's the oil and gas girl. But the reality is it fuels so much of our life. And just in the last closing minutes here, there's been some real attacks on the very industry that's protecting Americans, making us safe. When you look at what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, you look at the Middle East, you look at the Red Sea, and all the disruption and global calamities and catastrophes that's occurring, oil and gas in the United States, led by Texas, is leading the way, but there's been attacks on us. Can you just kind of recap some of those? You probably don't think about this very often in Washington. You probably don't see.
It crosses my mind from time to time. So look, Todd, as I happen to have right here in my hand, a little report called 200 Ways in Which the Biden Administration and Democrats Have Made It Hard to Produce Oil and Gas in the United States. It's actually, it's the Institute for Energy Research who puts it together, and they keep a rolling tally since January 2021 of the different actions, be it regulatory or legislative, that the administration has been attacking the industry and our ability to produce oil and gas. The bottom line is this, and I don't mean to be overly hyperbole, but the fact of the matter is this is a race to reshape our economy. Okay. And you've seen this administration it's the big issues of, banning internal combustion engines or restricting natural gas production and export, gas stoves, all these things. It's always been a 2-pronged approach for our industry, that they've taken a 2-pronged approach to constrained production or constrained demand. And that is the environment where you're living in. And they will not have invested 4 years to get us to this point to let that go. If they're given 4 more years, they will finish the job, so to speak. And I think there is an awful lot that is at risk. And it's not just high profile banning LNG exports, but it's coming after the Dune Lizard and other ESA listings, for example.
Right.
I wish I could be optimistic, but if this election goes against the industry itself and generally being able to produce, we're in for a really, really tough next 4 years, and it will reshape us whether we want it or not. So there's an awful lot at risk right now for us, I think.
Well, we're glad that you're in D.C. looking out for our interest and being a real partner with Texas. Shana, I've got a couple more questions for Tim that are real short, but do you have anything else before we?
Well, I know we're talking a little bit about the presidential race. So there is a debate scheduled on June 27th. Does that debate happen? And what do you, will we actually get to any issues in that debate, or will it just be the normal sparring, do you think?
Well, again, this is the election that none of us wanted. It's the debate that none of us wanted, the one we're all going to get deserved. Both sides agreed to it. Now, that may change because President Biden says he won't debate a convicted felon and could back out. I think that would likely backfire on him, though. I don't think American people will not let it happen. I think it could backfire if one of them backs out, I think.
Well, Tim, it's a long way from Election Day. A lot can happen in 6 months. But if you're handicapping these races, you've got the presidential race, you have the control of the U.S. Senate, control of the U.S. House. What do you think, or you feel comfortable telling our listeners today, if the election were today, how would those turn out?
Well, if the election were today, and if the polls are relatively accurate, I do think that President Trump would actually win, and I think he'd probably take the Senate and be able to keep the House as well. Again, that's based on what the sentiment is today, Todd. There's a lot that can happen, like you say, between now and November. But the fact of the matter is it's really interesting on energy, for example. In the past, if in an unfavorable pricing climate, we would all be blamed for being big oil. Industry just gouging, and they're trying to stick it to the consumer. The fact of the matter is the administration was so vocal in taking actions that constrained production, things like the Keystone XL and canceling leases on the very first day, and that cemented over the first 6 months of the administration that they were anti-oil and gas, and that has translated into a lack of support at the polls when there's an unfavorable pricing climate. It's good for us as an industry. I think the economy still is weighing heavily across all demographics. Immigration is weighing heavily across all demographics. And frankly, world events like Israel and Hamas, like you mentioned, in Iran, that is weighing heavily on people. And so I do think if it were held today, then I think that President Trump would probably win. But you can imagine what happens in July here if the New York court sentences Trump to 30 days in jail or home confinement or something like that. We're living in a bizarre world. We don't know exactly how things are going to look come the end of July. It's going to be fascinating.
Well, Tim, your insight, as always, is spot on. You've been very helpful today. I think you've helped educate us more on what's at stake here in November. You're very active on social media. You have great information that you send out. Tell our listeners how they can track you and find out more about Tim Stewart and U.S. Oil and Gas Association.
Well, I try and leave no trace. I try to maintain a lower profile, but probably the best way to follow us is on Twitter or X, US_OGA, U.S. Oil and Gas Association. I say things that probably need to be said that other people don't have the ability to say. So that's probably the best way to follow us on day to day. We have a tendency to see things and point them out, and then people have a tendency to follow and amplify it after that. But again, Todd, we love working with you guys. TXOGA is our favorite. You're so phenomenal. Such an important part of the U.S. economy. God bless you, and you're on the side of the angels. So let's keep working together.
Well, thank you for joining us again. Shana, thank you as always.
Absolutely. This was a fun conversation.
This is fun. I know I can keep going, but we'll save some for a future day.
That's right. We'll have to follow up with you afterwards.
That's right.
Yeah.
We most of all want to thank our listeners for tuning in. You're the ones that really matter. You're the constituents, the voters of Texas. You get to determine the future of our state. And as Texas goes, so goes our nation. So we thank you for listening to us today. Send us your feedback. Give us your ideas. And thank you for joining us for another episode of TXOGA Talks, where energy meets insight.
The views expressed on this podcast are not intended and should not be construed to be the views of any particular TXOGA member or company. The purpose of this podcast is to engage in candid conversations about energy needs, energy security, and the future of energy.